It's good to see a healthy number of people here tonight. Thank you for joining us. I hope that I will give you some guidance and some help in what can be both fun and challenging an aspect of writing your dissertation. It doesn't really matter at what stage you are today, especially you'll come to that conclusion very shortly. We should be thinking about writing our methodology right from the beginning of our dissertation process. I just wanted to take a quick note. Farrell mentioned the upcoming webinars that we're doing during May, and I just wanted to highlight about the second webinar, which I think was 21st or 22nd, I can't remember the exact date, but the self-progress review. This is quite an unusual workshop or unusual webinar. I actually use a review canvas or review template, which is ideal for anybody who's past their proposal stage. So if you've submitted your proposal, and it doesn't matter what stage you are past that, this will be a good way to review your own progress and to look at areas where you're doing well, but also at areas where you might want to rethink or realign or adjust what you're doing from that as well. So the title of the workshop isn't particularly, but believe me, the content and what we go through will certainly help anyone who's, partway through the process, even up to the point that you're, doing your final editing, because there's still an opportunity where we can, adjust things and, make sure that we're 100% aligned with what we had in mind for our research as well. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of that before I move on. And tonight, we're talking about writing about research methodology. And this is a really important topic because the methodology of our research is what really underpins its success. And in showcasing that the research that you have done is credible or solid, you need to be able to be confident to communicate and to express about what your methodology is. So there are 4 objectives for tonight, which we'll go through. To understand research output, we write about methodology, and of course the level of detail that is expected. And in fact, we write about methodology in a number of places, and some of this might surprise you. To understand the key information that is expected to be included in your methodology chapter. So the reality is, there is a template for this. As much as I hate templates and want to say be creative, there really is, you must cover these types of things. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some additional information that you might want to consider including in your methodology chapter or in the broader discussion where you are talking about methodology, because it is not black and white. It is not as using one particular methodology, writing a few things. There are peripheral issues that we give some consideration to as well. And finally, I'm going to give some practice tips or advice for executing the writing of your methodology chapter. I'm not going to talk about grammar and sentence structure here tonight. Happy to have those conversations separately. But what I'm going to talk about is how do we get what's up here and what we've done in our research, our computers, so that we have the framework that we need to be able to make sure we're communicating what our examiners and our end audiences expect from us. So often we take methodology for granted because there kind of is the assumption everybody knows how to do an interview or everybody knows how to do a survey, or actually many of the decisions that we make along our research journey, we take for granted because they're just an ordinary everyday decision for us as a researcher. But the reality is other people need to know about it too. And I'd like to start off tonight by reading from another scholar, Patrick Brindle, who wrote this, or actually he said it in 2018. Many of us, when we're writing, of course, are writing from experience. We are writing in the context of our own memories, of having done the research, of having carried out an interview, for example, or conducted experiments. Within that corpus of memory are all kinds of assumptions. I don't need to talk about this. I don't need to talk about that because but of course, if your readers weren't there when you were doing the research, it's not going to be obvious to them. And so it becomes absolutely critical when you do your final edit of anything you write about methods, that you subject the question of, would someone who wasn't there when I did my research understand everything that I did and all the decisions that I made? Now, that last question is the crux of it. It's about making sure that everybody who isn't part of the process actually understand. And that's the level at which you need to communicate your methodology section to your readers. So the key outtake that I have I explained the decisions regarding my choice of methods and my execution of those methods in such a way that convinces other people that I have made the right choices. Okay, let's move on. We're going to start by where methods sit in our dissertation. And I've got probably a diagram I'm going to forever regret using. Many of you will be familiar that the average PhD is a 5-chapter initiative. At the end of the day, I'm not a huge supporter of this because I think, you take what you need to convey it. But let's look at where we sit. We have a chapter, usually chapter 3, which will be specifically a detailed discussion on research methodology. But methodology is talked about in other areas too. It's talked about in the introduction, even in an abstract, where you highlight what was your overall approach to the research that you have. It's going to be talked about in the literature review because the reasons we review our literature is to give us guidance, both positive and negative, with respect to the literature that we're using. But what it tells us, or what we hope to get from this at the same time, is we want guidance on the method that we're using and on the methodology that is no longer considered to be ideal for the type of research we're doing. So in our literature review chapter, we're already discussing methodology. In our results chapter, there is an opportunity to touch on methodology because the methodology, of course, still has an opportunity to impact on the results. It is certainly going to be talked about in the conclusion, not only to summarize how you went about the research that gave you the results that you got, but that gives you an opportunity to say, if I was doing this research again, would I be doing it the same particular way? And you might have a yes or a no, but each of these junctures talk about methodology. So the point that I'm trying to get across is methodology isn't something that happens on its own. It may be a unique chapter within your dissertation, but the reality is it permeates almost every other chapter to some extent. So it is longitudinal in your process of research rather than sectional in your process of research. So I believe very much in terms of writing methodology, I believe in what's called the daily diary concept. And this simply says, as you're doing your research, write. Now, consider writing your methodology from day one of your research. It becomes like a diary, which later you edit, but it also reflects upon the decisions taken and the choices available. The methodology is not separate from your research writing. You know, it's an integral part of everything that creates your research and creates the narratives that you. So you need to make it personal. You need to make it concurrent. And you need to write about your decisions, not only what they were, but why they were made. Now let's come back and clarify what I mean by this. A lot of us will take the idea that I should sit down and write chapter 2 today. The thing is, as you're writing something, you're writing for more than one purpose, and you're probably writing for more, one particular piece. So I believe that you should have a variety of files out, whether you write on paper, whether you use the computer, I don't care. You can be as old-fashioned as you like here. But as you come through and you write, you should be making notes. You should be writing about your methodology. Now, when I talk about writing, I don't mean you should be writing a structured chapter. What I mean is you should be writing key points, key elements, key decisions that you have taken, key issues or speed bumps that you have run into along that journey. So that not only do you have the diary, but you start having functional sentences and paragraphs that you can edit into a methodology chapter closer to the completion of your dissertation. So I'm of a big belief that you really need to take that approach right from the start. Now, even if you're in your first 6 months of your PhD journey and you're starting to do your proposal, you're doing a literature review, you're trying to put things together, this is still an opportunity for you to talk about or to write about research methodology, because you have to make decisions not only based upon author X or author Y says this is the methodology to use, but out of all the options available to you as a researcher, what is influencing your decision to go a certain way? Read. Now, as you do your literature review, not only are you trying to say what the gaps are and what the directions are, as you do your literature review, what are your thoughts on this particular process or on this particular way of going about things? And as you think about that, that becomes later on, that becomes your intuition, but that also has the potential later to become justification. So many times we think about something, we don't write it down. Later on, we try to say, what was it? So I very much want to encourage you to look at the daily diary concept for methodology so that you have these notes when you come to write about it. So let's move on, and we're going to talk about what do I include or what do I not include in this process. Okay, so here's an overview of the things that you should be including in your methodology chapter. Now, remember I said before, methodology touches on so many parts of the thesis. This section, I really just want to talk about the methodology chapter. Now, it's quite scary. As I was putting this together, I went back to my own dissertation, which is on the shelves behind me. And I got out my dissertation. I looked at my methodology chapter, which was some years ago. And I looked at it, I'm like, oh God, terrible. I wish I'd taught myself back then. But these are the things to look at. Now, I'm going to encourage you. This gives you a framework of what is ideal. The level of depth that you go into is going to differ depending upon your subject, your choice of methodology, and how much you need to explain to the reader. We're not, as they say, teaching grandma to suck eggs. We are explaining our choices to educated individuals. We're not teaching a first-year student how to do research. So there is a difference in how you will write up that aspect. But the key things that we want to have included are the aims, the ethical considerations, the outline of methods chosen, the reason we choose specific methods, the explanation of the methods. Was the data analyzed? What materials or equipment were used for research? Were there any hurdles or difficulties faced during the research? And finally, we get to beat ourselves up with an evaluation. Now, before you think, oh my God, he ran through that really fast, I'm going to go through each one for you to give you an idea of what we expect. Now, you've got to, as we do this, you've got to think, how relevant and to what depth do I need to explain this to my audience? Now, quick question. Who is your audience? Is it your supervisor? Is it your examiners when you come to finally submit the dissertation, both for the text version, but also for your Viva? Or is it for the general audience who may in fact be reading your dissertation or elements of it later, including future generation of researchers who are going to look up to you and say, that's good, now it's my turn to do better. So think about who your audiences are. It is more than your supervisor. Your audience has got to be anybody who is likely to read your dissertation from an academic perspective to do something with it. So it actually includes all three of those particular categories. Let's start off with aims. Very simple. Now, each of these sections become a part of the chapter that you have. The length that you want each of these sections to be is going to differ. Some may be several pages long because there are a lot of decisions and choices and key relevant information you need to include. Others may be as simple as 1 or 2 paragraphs, which, to be honest, your aims is likely to be. Okay, we need you in your aims section to reiterate your research topic or your question, give an overview of how you plan to investigate this. Now, in terms of the overall structure of your dissertation, you're always going to have elements that are going to be repeated. And these repeated elements might be just a couple of key phrases or even a paragraph. You know, you might find the same paragraph appears 2 or 3 places in your thesis because you're funneling your audience, you're funneling the readers towards remembering certain key facts or certain key pointers, guides in what you're doing. Aims could potentially be one of these. Now, the ethical considerations is a big one. If any of you guys have come to any of my ethics sessions, I think I've done a couple of ethics sessions in research already, you'll be aware that almost every research regardless of how you choose to conduct it, regardless if it is qualitative, quantitative, whether you're looking at mixed methods, regardless of that, there are always going to be considerations. Even if you're doing historical research using documents, there's ethical considerations. So what becomes very important in this is to make sure that you outline what ethical or philosophical considerations are to be made. You need to list and explain. Now, these are considerations like informed consent. These are considerations like right to privacy. These are considerations relating to misleading participants, just so that you can make sure getting them on board for your study. So many things to talk about, but you're not about defining what the ethical dilemma is about. What you're doing is you're explaining there is an ethical consideration here. This is what it is in context of my research, and this is how I solved it. Because at the end of the day, you grow as a researcher through the solutions that you create, not the fact that you sweep something under the carpet and hope nobody notices. Now, in addition to the ethics considerations and the principles of ethics, you will have gone through, or 99.9% of you will have gone through some form of ethics committee approval. Now, an ethics committee has so many different names across the world. I think in the States, they call it a review board or something like that. But at the end of the day, someone in your university will have seen an application from you requesting that they confirm your research is done along acceptable ethical standards. That doesn't mean you have to do it ethically. What it means is if you are taking risks with other people, that the university has said, you know what, that is a fair risk to take, and we accept you moving forward with that. So you will need to include your ethics committee approval, including your approval number with this. And you might want to mention any realignments or pivots that you've had along the way. And you can have a realignment or a pivot both with the ethics, and you can have a realignment or a pivot with the research itself. So, and often both come together. If we look at what is happening now, and before we started, I heard Farrell talk to one of the participants that you're in the data collection phase. I mean, congratulations, and I also feel sorry for you, because in the middle of a global pandemic, nothing is happening the way we expect it to happen. And because of that, we might have had to change some elements of our methodology. Maybe not what we want to find out, but we might have had to have changed, for example, a focus group. Instead of being able to meet face-to-face with 6 to 8 individuals, we have to do this online. Doing it online changes the ethics, it changes the meaning of the methodology, it changes some of the parameters of analysis, and we need to be able to explain that we made a change along those lines, which then probably needs ethics committee reapproval to make it happen. All right, then we move into an outline of the methods that have been chosen. You know, were we using qualitative, quantitative, or both? Now, I call this a brief outline. You know, in a way, it does not even deserve its own heading in some respects. But, you know, have a little bit of fluidity here. I just want to make sure that you are aware to cover these points. How they flow is a different matter, but you do overview, a description, and you want to link it back to your literature review. Now, this is where I said, again, remember one of the early things, you know, you've got the fact that you have a methodology chapter, but methodology permeates everywhere. As does everywhere permeate somehow into the methodology that we're using. So it's important that we have the opportunity to be able to acknowledge that. All right, let's move, whoops, sorry, one more. Let's move on to the reasons for choosing our specific research methods. Now, this is not where we go back to our literature review and say, Smith, 2019, suggested that it was a bad idea to do X, so we are doing Y. That works if you are doing an undergraduate. What you need to be able to do is say, why is this method superior to other methods or to precursor methods, those methods that have been used beforehand? Yes, we cite the literature in terms of the direction, but you need to be able to explain why you chose this. Perhaps it is access to a population. Perhaps it is the need for a fresh approach because the older methods or the existing methods in use have really hit a limitation and you want to be able to springboard and take that further. So indicate research approach both fits within the general study and make sure that you have a clear connection to your overall approach. Explain how they help you, right? And I really want to emphasize this. Explain how they help you towards understanding your study's purpose. Because at the end of the day, you're writing a dissertation not for your supervisor, not for your examiners, not for future generations of researchers who are going to look at what you wrote and go, yay, let's do something different or something better. But this is your education. This is you developing the professional you as a researcher. So how did it help you to understand where you were going? Now, a lot of people will say, look, we don't want to write a dissertation in the first person. We don't want it to be a personal me, or I. But we do want to showcase that as a researcher, we have considered the options and we have strategically chosen the most appropriate option for the particular scenario. Right, an explanation of the methods chosen. This is where we get to go a little bit deeper than previously. We want to know the rationale for selecting. Now, the rationale can be very different. The rationale can be things about access to population. It can be about failed research attempts previously. It can be about previous researchers have indicated that they believe this would be the next step, and you are now designing it to make it happen. So, you know, think about what the rationale will be. How are you going to describe that? Now, the rationale can also be something a little bit different. And remember, I just gave the example of the participant tonight who's just currently doing her data collection. Given the pandemic, given everything that has happened globally, it has impacted most research candidates' work. And an intelligent researcher is not going to say, let me wait until the world get back to normal and then we'll start again. An intelligent researcher is going to say, how do I change the playing field a little bit so that I can get what I need now to further my research? Remember, it's about you, okay? So the rationale for selecting may be situations that have happened because of the pandemic have forced us to re-examine practical data collection methods. And because of this, we have chosen X, Y, or Z given the parameters of society today. Because remember, your research is always going to be a snapshot of time. Therefore, if you're doing research in this environment, you're struck or you're stuck by the parameters that are there, which is, lockdowns, no travel, so many things. So in that case, that can become a rationale. And even if we have changed today and tomorrow suddenly COVID miraculously disappears and the world opens up and we all go back to how we were, you're not going to repeat your data collection. You're going to analyze the data based on what you've got. So remember, consider it a photograph, a snapshot in time. Put that in as your rationale. You want to overview why these were most important. So where, when, and who. Now, if we look at qualitative methods, quantitative methods, let me read you a few questions for each that you should consider addressing in this section. Sorry, I'm going to do it from my notes here. Under personal observations, so observational research, where and when did you conduct the observations? Who did you observe? Were they part of a particular community or group? How long did each observation take? How did you record your findings? Did you collect audio recordings, video footage, or written observations? In terms of focus groups, where and when did the focus group take place? Who was involved? How were they selected? How many people took part? Were the questions asked structured, unstructured, or semi-structured? Remember also to include a copy of the questions that were used as an appendix. So that's important. If you're doing any form of questions, whether it be an interview, a focus group, a survey, always make sure that those become part of the appendix. If you're doing an unstructured interview, for example, where you are really just talking about several themes and there are not questions that you've predetermined, you still have or should have a transcript of the interview. And those questions should still be written down and included as an appendix within your dissertation so that we can see, the examiners can see, the future researchers can see, actually, what did you ask? And for future researchers, or for you if you're looking for ideas, that's also where we can get inspiration on how to strengthen your research or springboard from your research. Because why start from scratch when we can take somebody else's questionnaire or interview or focus group instructions and strengthen that, evolve that, and use it ourselves? If I look at interviews, where and when did the interviews take place? Who took part? How did you select the participants? What type of questions did you ask? How did you record your findings? All of these similar across the three, but it is about addressing the process. I know how an interview works. You don't need to explain to me how you do an interview, but you do need to explain to me, we approached through a database supplied by 17% of those approached responded. 17% is pretty damn impressive, by the way. We set up interview at or through this technology. We verified the individuals by this approach. The questions are done in a semi-structured manner, starting with 4 questions on demography. So there is a very step-by-step, almost fundamentally easy approach to writing this. But what you're doing is you're telling me a lot about your respondents, your approach to getting and asking them, and in some way to how you're analyzing them as well. But you're giving me an overview. So I know that you interviewed 17 people. A further research student may say, look, that was a great introductory study, but 17 people is not enough for me to take this outside of a particular geographic area, for example. I want to study, or I want to do a comparison with another city, or I want to do a comparison with another culture. All of that gives us the opportunity to replicate and to further undertake that research as well. If we move on to quantitative, and I apologize, I really, oops, informational data. Sometimes I type a little, I need to. What were, or external information or data, I should say. What were the sources of materials used? Now, this could be historical research. This could be grey literature. If you've come to my grey literature session, which I think was last year, you know, there's some really fascinating opportunities within grey literature where we can get information and data. So the questions we ask are, what were the sources? How did you select the material? Did you only use data published within a particular time frame? If we're doing experiments, what tools or equipment did you use? What techniques were required? Note that when we conduct experiments, we need to provide enough information to allow another researcher to conduct the experiment and obtain the same results. So this is about the ability to explain your process so that others can replicate. And finally, surveys. You know, were respondents asked to answer multiple choice questions or complete free text fields? How many questions were there? How long were people given to answer the questions? What were the demographics? What sampling technique did you use? And again, remember to have a copy of the survey in the appendix afterwards. How was the data analyzed? Now you're going to move on to a data analysis chapter, but you need to be able to mention a few things. Coding, checking for missing data, outliers. Basically, how did you make sure that you could translate what was there, verify that it was acceptable for your use and complete, and then put into a system, most likely software. So did you use software? Now, there's always going to be an argument here. There are a lot of software options depending upon what you need. If you're a qualitative researcher like me, you may go down the track of using a software like NVivo. Fantastic software, pretty old, but evolving and certainly ideal. But NVivo costs money. Or if you're a quantitative researcher, you may want to use SPSS or one of the bigger data packages. But again, SPSS or a license for SPSS costs money. There's an alternative. We can use R. R is free, but we have to be able to explain. Again, this is about replication. If I use SPSS 20.2, another researcher needs to be able to come along, take the data that I have, perform exactly what I performed, and get exactly the same results. Now, if they choose to do that in R and I did it in SPSS, if the results differ, that's not a problem for us as the researcher. It's only a problem for us as the researcher if we specify the exact software we used. Now you might think, oh, why do I have to put this there? It is all about the integrity of the research process, which means you're showcasing everything's out in the open. This is how I did it. You can copy, you can replicate, you can prove me right, or you can prove me wrong. Now, let's go back to commercial versus open access software. Although universities may encourage you towards commercial, probably because they get a cut every time a student from there buys a particular software license, there is absolutely no requirement that you use commercial software. If you can find open access software that is reputable, for example, R, use it. You know, this is about you saving money or you fitting into a budget as much as it is about you analyzing your data or using tools to process and to analyze your data that will work. So as long as it's reputable, go for it. A further section, what materials or equipment were used. So it might talk about the lab equipment, specific software, which I've just talked about, kind of an overlap. But this is in terms of collecting data. So even if I talk about a focus group that I did online, you know, I'm using the Zoom platform. Okay, it may not be a huge amount of sentences, but I am talking about it. Why did I choose Zoom? Simply because it is cost effective. It is one of the dominant online platforms for communication, conversations currently. And because it's one of the dominant ones, more people, more respondents were comfortable with using it. That gives us some justifications. And then hurdles or difficulties. Now, nobody here tonight, I think, unless you're extremely lucky, is going to journey through PhD without some hiccups or speed bumps or whatever. There's always going to be difficulties associated with research. It might be, you know, finding participants, getting informed consent, access to equipment, resource shortages, a whole number of things. You know, it could be, I think the worst case, you've interviewed 100 individuals, you've spent thousands of hours preparing for and interviewing these individuals, and 10 of them email you back and say, I withdraw my consent. That's a hurdle or a difficulty, and that needs to be noted. You know, 6%, or in this case, 10% of respondents after the process had been conducted requested to withdraw from the study. That's fine. That does not impact on you as a researcher. All as it does is it gives you 10% less data to use and wasted some time. But it is something that you should note. So, you know, if you've had people withdraw, if you've not been able to access the equipment that you needed. For example, the university did not have SPSS available. So we went the direction of using R. How do you overcome the situation? So finding participants, a common one I see that I really dislike, but I think in the world of COVID is becoming relatively more acceptable. Still not totally to me, but relatively. It's very difficult to get respondents to a survey. And it becomes easier to use social media to try and get respondents where you run the risk that the individual respondent is not really an ideal target audience. They're not really aligned 100%, but because you cannot go out to community groups, because you may not be able to reach into physical organizations to talk to people, you're left with this. So what you're doing is your solution is your next best alternative, your plan B. But that's how you overcame them. What it shows the examiner is, how do you solve problems that are common? Anybody for us, any of us as researchers, how do you solve problems, and how do you move forward, making sure that you have got, the best solution available at the moment. And the final part of what to include and what not to include really is an evaluation. Now, again, remember I said research methods or writing about methods permeates almost everywhere in your dissertation, okay? So it's no surprise that at the methods chapter, you cannot, or you should not have, a simple paragraph that evaluates and justifies your choice of methods. Now, here's the problem. I've just spent 8 months interviewing people, conducting focus groups, observing them, trolling through thousands of pages of historical data. And I'm really not that happy with my result. So be it. It's about what you learn from the process, not necessarily whether the outcome is what you expected it to be. What did you learn from that process? So an opportunity to say, look, this worked well up until a point. I don't feel I got what I expected. You're going to use much nicer language than that, but that's perfectly acceptable and something that I would genuinely include here. All right, let's move on to the second half and then we'll go into a Q&A session. I'm going to talk about some writing tips. Again, my purpose tonight is not about giving you sentence structure and vocabulary and stuff like that. I believe that the process is about writing and getting it on paper. Editing is a whole different thing. If you try to write, if you sit down and you try to write and you try to make it perfect from the beginning, I believe you're doomed to fail. My experience has always been, look, write as much as you can. That's why I say, write the methodology section from day one. Put different thoughts down. Have them available. Date them if necessary. Put them together. Editing is what we do once we've got the bulk of things together. So it doesn't matter if it's in first person or third person. It doesn't matter if there are spelling mistakes or grammatical mistakes at this stage. What matters is you're getting across the ideas so that you can structure them, so that you can massage them. And then once you're comfortable with that flow and making sure that, yeah, I go back a few slides, I've ticked all of these boxes because these are the things I needed to include, then you can edit and you can strengthen and you can make sure that it is consistent in terms of how it works. So I'm just going to give you a few very basic tips for writing. I don't think there's anything here that's going to blow anybody's mind away. First of all, methodology has been written about for as long as people have done research. It gets more technical over time because of technology, because of the level of detail that we develop in our research. But I always believe that you should look at other people's methodology sections. In your university library, there will be other theses, other dissertations. Go check them. Photocopy or scan, a few of the research methodology chapters. This is not for you to steal. This is not for you to, find an ideal structure. It's for you to see how other people have done it. And it's for you a bit of inspiration at the same time. By looking, and you know, the inspiration does not have to be people in the same field as you or the same, you know, even the same discipline. It's simply looking at how other people handle or tackle the challenge of this. Plan your structure. So I've given you, in a way, I've given you like a template of a structure, but plan that. Fit your information in and then look at it before you edit. Look at it and say, look, I think something's missing. And this is where we get to look back at other people's methodology sections, because we can look and we can say, you know what, they had a section on this. Should I have the same section? And then you write it. Consider who your audience are going to be. And, you know, I just want to really emphasize that there's two ways to look at this. One, your audience is your supervisor, your examination panel, but it's also other researchers who are going to be reading what has been your input into, you know, into the research over time, okay? So, you know, you've got an intelligent audience. We're not talking about first year students, you know, we're not talking about those who are inexperienced. We're talking about those who are experienced. So from that, what we've got to remember is our discussion is more on the decisions that we made and the reason for them, rather than teaching them a method which they probably already know. And if they don't know it, they probably shouldn't be, you know, in a university. At all times, remain focused on your aims and your research questions, right? This is about making sure that, you know, you're coming back, you're tying it back in. It's like shoelaces on a shoe. It's always bringing things back to make sure it holds together. Make sure that you refer to obstacles or difficulties in your solutions, because this is, again, how did you grow as a researcher as much as what did you find out about? And finally, make sure you still cite relevant sources. Now, point and task here is a relevant source in a research methodology chapter is not an article from 1970 that started the discipline. It is something from the last year or two at most. Okay, you can have older citations or older references elsewhere in your dissertation, but in the methodology section, you want it to be the most up-to-date, because other researchers are pushing you towards this direction. So if you have something that's a little bit outdated in this section, my first question to you would be, oh, could somebody have done it differently in the last year? So make sure that you are very up to date in this. And finally, some of the issues to avoid, okay? Avoid including irrelevant details. You don't need to teach somebody how you did a cluster sample. You need to explain what the cluster sample was and how you got that, but not what it is. So it's really about not teaching grandma to suck eggs, basically. Again, it's knowing your audience. Keep the section straightforward and thorough. If it doesn't contribute to your reader's understanding, leave it out. So remember, I asked a question before, you know, does this answer the question as to why and how I conducted this? If it doesn't answer that question, it's not going to be important. Okay, so irrelevant information includes unnecessary explanation of basic procedures. Only explain these if they're unconventional or unfamiliar to your audience. So say, for example, you know, I think back to my area of interest when I was doing my dissertation. And I'm an economist by training, which is kind of sad, but I was doing, research on globalization. I was doing research on Asian business. And a new technique, surprisingly, um, around that period of time was the use of personal interviews. Most business research had been quantitative, and going to interview business owners, CEOs, patriarchs of family firms was quite unusual. So even though the concept of the interview was pretty straightforward, because it was unconventional in this type of research, you got an opportunity to explain a little bit more about it. Because most of the people who would be reading at the time would have gone down the quantitative route. And final point is, don't ignore analyzing or discussing problems. How we solve problems, how we come to our problems really says a lot about us as researchers, how we adjusted what we were doing to overcome a small roadblock or an issue that we were faced with. That is actually really valuable to the journey. Plus, ignoring what it means to you, your reader further down the track, your reader is going to want to understand the pitfalls you fell into and that you uncovered, so that when they are thinking of extrapolating from or expanding from or springboarding from your research, then they have an opportunity to think, okay, these were the pitfalls. Now I'm going to come across a solution or a bridge for that so that my research will be stronger. So it's not only about you as a researcher, but it's about all the researchers that will follow you. Now, the final section before I move into a Q&A session, a bit shorter tonight than normal, but the final section is consider identity. Now, this is not going to apply to everybody. This is very much a social science thing. But that being said, we have to be able to look whether it applies to us or not. So I asked the question, who am I as a researcher? This is not, I'm Craig, I'm an economist. This is, I'm a mid-40s white male who is conducting research in Asia in a language that is not his first. I am an outsider, I am a visitor, I am somebody who has not grown up in this particular culture. That's my identity. So what identity issues or what elements of you as a researcher may impact upon your perception of the research? Now, this is not about you shouldn't be doing this research then, Craig, because you're not local. This is about how do you resolve or find or negotiate a solution to make your research ideal. Now, in the social sciences in particular, it is becoming more and more prevalent that researchers and research students do some form of reflection on their role and their position as a researcher. But as I said, this is not for everyone. I put it in here tonight because if you are doing research that is taking you outside of your cultural boundaries, or you are working with a marginalized community group, for example, this is something that you should be including into your methodology chapter, an acknowledgement of the difference between you as the researcher and them as the researched. But it's not going to apply to everybody. So don't, if you're doing an accounting degree and you're looking at forensic accounting, for example, suddenly go, oh my God, how do I fit myself in here? Because chances are it's not important. But if you're doing some work, for example, with teenage mothers who have been abandoned by their family, and you're doing some action research to try and, help better. I as a, a mid-40s from a privileged background cannot identify. So I need to be able to explain those processes. So this is something that some of us have to consider, but not all of us. So don't look at it and go, oh my God, how am I going to do that? If that's your instant reaction, it probably won't apply to you. But if anything that I've just said, it's like, oh yeah, I think I understand this, and that's going to apply to you, then the methodology chapter is the right place to be able to include it.